Very good morning to you, Jim. We're back for our second episode of Season 5. We've called the episode Money, but our real focus isn't so much on pound coins or £5 notes found in our coat pockets. We're going to talk about the global financial system that underpins just about everything that people do in the modern world. What actually goes on in those gleaming skyscrapers in the city of London or in New York.
Yes, the financial markets are a feature of modern life that most Christians don't really think about. And yet they play an enormously important role in how we live. A lazy summary of this episode would be to call it capitalism, but that term is so heavily loaded that for most of the discussion, I'm going to be talking about market economies. I regard capitalism as an ideology, and we'll think about that at the end of the discussion.
Yeah, the word capitalism is actually pretty controversial in Christian circles. An increasing number of young Christian adults, even in the US, now call themselves socialists. Or at least they think that socialism is a lot more noble than capitalism. So once we've set the scene, I want to break this conversation down into two halves. In the first half, I'll let you make the case of a market economy. But in the second half, we'll explore the really deep problems that emerge from a capitalist system.
Good. I think that structure reflects the Bible's nuanced view of wealth creation and redistribution. And people who say capitalism is wonderful and people who say capitalism is evil are both wrong, in my opinion. So the position I'm going to adopt is that a market economy is the least worst way for humanity to organize itself. But as we'll see, the underlying ideology has a fatal flaw that will one day cause the whole system to collapse. So I would ask people to let the whole story unfold before deciding that I'm a ruthless right-wing capitalist, because I'm nothing of the sort.
Yeah, some people have already turned off this podcast and flicked to another episode. But yeah, hopefully you'll stay with us. That fatal flaw you mentioned comes center stage in the Bible in Revelation chapter 18, which gives us a really dramatic account of the collapse of a global system of commerce. The Apostle John uses the shocking image of a prostitute riding on the back of a terrifying beast to describe it. In the authorized version of the Bible, it translates John's phrase as the great whore of Babylon. And his use of Babylon as a symbol of global commerce is going to be important for our conversation, because our thesis is that the fatal flaw you just mentioned is identified in the very first book of the Bible, when it discusses the origin of Babylon.
Yes, that's our big idea, if you like, in this series. The eventual collapse of the global financial system can be traced back to its origin. So we've been exploring in this season of the podcast this idea of origins. If you want to understand something, work out where it came from. It's only by going back to the origination point of an idea that its nature can be understood.
Okay, but we have a long way to go before we turn to the Bible's discussion of mystical Babylon. To get us into this discussion then, Jim, just give us a sense of what we mean by the term global financial system.
Okay, well, let's start with the really familiar concept of a market. Just think of the Christmas market in Belfast each year. It's a place that connects suppliers of goods with customers. It's a place for us to trade to, buy and sell stuff. But when it comes to more complicated trading, there are big flows of money involved. So think for a moment about all the investors and suppliers involved in building something like the Channel Tunnel or HS2. Where does the money for something like that come from? Well, it comes from financial markets. And in the modern world, financial markets are global. There's this vast system of interconnected institutions like central banks and government treasuries and major private banks, and they control the flows of financial capital used for investment and trade all over the world. And obviously they operate in accordance with some, international treaties. So you can imagine it a bit like the plumbing system in your house that pipes hot water to you whenever you need to turn on a tap.
And that all sounds like a far cry from keeping 200 quid in a tin box under your bed, Jim.
It certainly is. The numbers involved are staggering. In broad terms, about $80 trillion of assets are held inside the system. But if you add in what are called derivatives, then that number explodes into the quadrillions. So every day, many, many billions of pounds are flowing through our financial markets. The problem we face in this conversation, Ollie, is that everything we've said so far sounds really abstract to most sane people. The world of stock market crashes, speculative bubbles, hedge funds, short selling, all that stuff is alien to most of us. But this invisible global plumbing really does have a massive impact on our lives. Just look at the spike in energy prices that we're going to experience over the next year. When the system goes wrong, we get recession and unemployment and inflation.
And there are some really good examples of times in history when the financial markets went badly wrong. Back in 2008, there was a serious crash that brought us into the recession. But maybe the best example is called the Great Depression. And that started in 1929 in the United States. The stock market and Wall Street crashed. And within a couple of years, industrial production fell by half. Unemployment went from 3% to 24% of the population. Crop prices fell by 60%. Incomes dropped by 40% at least.
Yeah, and behind those numbers lie stories of terrible hardship. Office workers had to grow vegetables in their gardens, and they patched their clothes. The suicide rate rocketed. In the US, about 2 million men and women became wandering hobos, catching illegal rides on freight trains in a desperate search for work. Another example of when things go wrong is something we've talked about before, the hyperinflation that Germany experienced in the 1930s. Paper money became so valueless that people were taking wheelbarrows full of cash into the supermarket in order to buy a loaf of bread. A banknote that was, say, worth the equivalent of $1 would, in 1 year's time, be worth 1/10000000th of a dollar. And there's a famous story about a German housewife who was robbed. The thief grabbed her shopping bag that was stuffed full of German banknotes, and he emptied the banknotes out onto the floor and ran off with the shopping bag because money had become so valueless.
Yeah, it's absolutely crazy. But before I let you make the case for a market economy, Jim, I want to address the question that will be in many of the minds of our listeners. Surely capitalism is not a Christian concept. A really large number of young Christians are starting to call themselves socialists, as I mentioned previously. Capitalism is increasingly seen as this oppressive force in society, one that divides society into winners and losers. Surely it is more Christian to argue that everyone should have an equal share of a country's wealth.
Well, I think there are two main reasons why so many young Christians are flirting with socialism. At the risk of alienating our entire listener base, I think maybe the first reason is a little bit of naivety about how poverty is alleviated. So let me now argue and defend that ridiculous assertion. And go back to basics. If I want to alleviate poverty, I need wealth. Yes, it takes wealth to alleviate poverty. But wealth doesn't grow on magical money trees. Wealth has to be created and then redistributed. And some young Christians think that the government has wealth, but governments don't have wealth. They have no money of their own. They receive money in the form of taxes and they borrow like crazy sometimes, but they are incapable of creating wealth themselves. A government's job is to redistribute the wealth it's got from others. So the big question here is, what is the best way to create wealth? And there are only two possible ways. You either have a market economy or you have a command and control economy. Those are your only two options. You either create a framework that allows individuals to be creative and to take risks and then to gain personal reward, or else you create a top-down command and control economy where the government owns everything, the government decides what gets built, and the government decides how much everyone should pay for it. Those are your only two options. So the first pushback would be, okay, so how do you propose to create the wealth you need to alleviate poverty?
A good number of young believers who are uncomfortable with capitalism would point to passages in the Bible that seem to be very critical of wealth creation. The Lord Jesus himself said that love of money is a root of all evil. We read in the Gospels how he drove out the money changers from the temple with a whip of cords. In Acts chapter 2, the early church seemed to have adopted a socialist model. Luke says all who believed were together and had all things in common, and they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all, as any had need.
Yeah, we could also add in the thundering voices of Amos and Isaiah with their denunciations of the rich who trample on the rights of the poor. But we need to think carefully about these passages. When Jesus drives out the money changers, he's not denouncing the idea of a marketplace. He's angered by those who pervert the gospel by turning it into a money-making racket. Those money changers were reducing salvation to a financial transaction. So that's what angered the Lord. The Acts 2 passage, you're quite right, does indeed seem to describe a socialist model. But it was unsustainable. I mean, just read through the rest of the New Testament and you'll see that the other churches had to create a bailout for the Jerusalem church. The other thing I would say is that it seems to me that the Bible is not against the concept of private ownership. The 8th commandment, thou shalt not steal, presupposes private ownership. And the Bible never criticizes the link between personal endeavor and personal reward. In fact, it's astonishing, I was just saying to someone yesterday, just how often the Lord's parables praise risk-taking entrepreneurs. Think of the parable of the talents, for example. So I don't think that the Bible can be used to develop a socialist model. Now, it can be used to argue for a very generous welfare state, but that's a separate question. As a general rule, the Bible is supremely uninterested in how much wealth you create, but it is very, very interested in how much money you keep for yourself. That's a conversation, as I said, about wealth distribution, not wealth creation.
So those are your two pushbacks, if you like, to young Christians who embrace socialism. In order to alleviate poverty, wealth must be created. If it's not created via the market, then how should it be created? And then second, the Bible does not advocate a socialist position. In fact, it celebrates what we might call an entrepreneurial spirit.
Yeah, Churchill once said, he was talking about democracy, and he said that democracy was the worst form of government except for all the others. And I would apply that same principle to markets. A market economy is the least worst option. In a fallen world, how do we organize ourselves so that most people are benefited? We need a real answer to that question, not some utopian dream. And it seems to me that a market economy delivers four things. It delivers information, innovation, incentives, and investment. It's really just a device to manage all that complexity. And it works out automatically what people want, how much they're prepared to pay for it. And that information always produces what we might call a creative spark. It's a moment of innovation. An entrepreneur looks at the information produced by the market, and then he then creates a product that meets the demand opened up by the market. Investors then fall in behind the entrepreneur to fund the development of the product, because both the entrepreneur and the investor are incentivized by the prospect of making profit. So what is the alternative? Well, the only alternative is to have, an army of saints, someone once called it, who operate a vast centralized bureaucracy. These saints would have to be completely incorruptible. They would have to be endlessly creative. They would also have to be omniscient. And as the writer of the Ecclesiastes points out, in a fallen world, bureaucracies are never like that. They always become oppressive. He says, if you see in a province the oppression of the poor and the violation of justice and righteousness, do not be amazed at the matter. For the high official is watched by a higher, and there are yet higher ones over them. Now, you could write that verse over the horrors of the great socialist experiments of the 20th century.
It seems to me, Jim, that you're making two arguments here in support of a market economy. The first one is that history proves that they work quite well. And the second is that the only alternative, which is socialism, has been proven to be much worse for humanity. So let's think for a moment about the history of financial markets. And it's actually a really interesting story. Of course, there has been trading from almost the dawn of time, but the first real step towards the world we have today came in the 13th century, when Italian merchants developed double-entry bookkeeping.
That sounds like an unbelievably prosaic event, but it was enormously significant because it allowed profit to be identified. So then we can fast forward to maybe the 16th, 17th century. The next big step was taken by the Dutch. In fact, I think it was in the 1630s that the first futures trading developed in Amsterdam. I find this quite an amusing story because tulips suddenly became fashionable. Their intense colour was seen as a status symbol, and so a speculative bubble was developed. At one point, a single tulip bulb could cost as much as 10 years' wage for a skilled worker. So a futures market emerged where, I would show you 10 tulip bulbs sitting in my flower shop and you would agree to buy the flower for a set price once the thing had bloomed. Okay. So that example is used by economists to illustrate the first ever derivative financial product. I just sold you a future tulip, Ollie, and the value of that future tulip was derived from the tulip bulb sitting in my flower shop.
I actually really love the idea of you running a flower shop, Jim. Have you ever actually considered it? Seriously?
It's not an obvious career choice, I have to say. But then neither was being a Bible teacher. Anyway, all that Dutch experience was then transferred to England when William of Orange was made king. And then we get the really big moment in economic history. In the 18th century, Britain develops the first real financial system, and it was based on two simple principles. The first is what's called sound money. In other words, Britain at that time offered stability, governed by an independent reserve bank. So if you invested £10 in my flower shop, you could be confident that £10 today would still be worth £10 in a year's time. So that was the first thing, sound money. The second thing Britain offered investors was this liberal environment where individual entrepreneurs could take risk and compete with each other without the government sticking its big nose in. Now, as I say, those might sound like two simple ideas, but they revolutionized the world. They really did. It's increasingly common for historians to argue today that it was Britain's financial system, rather than the invention of the steam engine, that drove its astonishing growth over the next 2 centuries.
And can we find evidence of the impact of a market economy on people's standard of living?
Oh, yes. In the 2 centuries after 1750, daily life changed more than it had done in the previous 7,000 years. I mean, the graph is just astonishing if you see it. The graph which shows average, living standards. It's simply undeniable that Britain's standard of living increased 12-fold in that time period. Now, of course, technology was at the heart of the revolution. But I happen to be flicking through a list of what's called the most important inventions of the Industrial Revolution. And the thing which struck me was how small most of them are, how specific. In 1769, a water frame for cotton spinning was patented. In 1780, a sliding hatch water wheel. 1799, bleaching powder made from chlorine and lime. The idea of tinned meats, patented in 1814. Something called a self-actor mule that automated part of the spinning process. Now, here's my point. An idea without finance is just an idea. But there was something about the 18th and 19th century in Britain that turned its people into a nation of inventors and entrepreneurs. And that thing was Britain's financial system of sound money and a liberal hands-off approach to wealth creation.
So based on what you're saying, Jim, there seems to be a strong case that market economies have had an amazingly positive impact on world history. Your second argument is that the only alternative to wealth creation is something called socialism, and you argue it hasn't worked. Is there any evidence to back up that claim?
Everywhere socialism has been tried, it has failed. I'm sorry if that offends people, but it's true. Think of the 2 great social experiments of the 20th century, the Soviet Union and China. Those experiments resulted in tens of millions of deaths from famine and disease. But we could also think of experiments in Cambodia, Venezuela, Bolivia, Cuba, or Zimbabwe.
Today, people like Bernie Sanders point to countries like Sweden, Denmark, and Norway. Aren't they examples of successful socialism?
No, they're not, because the Nordic countries are all market economies. They take a capitalist approach to wealth creation. They have low corporate tax rates. They have high VAT, which is actually a regressive form of taxation. But what they do have is a very large welfare state. Countries like Denmark and Sweden spend a great deal of money on things like universal health care and education. So the Nordic countries may be examples of massive wealth distribution, but their approach to wealth creation is the same as we might find in the UK or the US. So in that sense, they aren't socialist.
Thinking back, Jim, to our series on church history, which seems like a long time ago now, we talked a lot in the final episode about the social disasters that flowed from the 1917 Marxist revolution in Russia. Both the Soviets and the Chinese really did try to implement Marxist economic theory, didn't they?
They certainly did. Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, said that communism would bury capitalism. He described capitalism as like a dead herring in the moonlight, shining brilliantly as it rotted.
What a quote.
I was reading a book a couple of nights ago about Mao Zedong, or Chairman Mao, as he used to be called. He became president of the People's Republic of China in 1949. And his socialist economic plan was called the Great Leap Forward. It was launched, I think, at the end of the 1950s. We shall create a new heaven and earth for man, Mao said to his 650 million followers. Now, just give me a quick minute, Ollie, to describe how that experiment, how that great leap forward in socialism played out in history. Remember, socialism demands a command and control economy. There's no private ownership, there's no market. Everything is driven by edicts from the central bureaucracy. So what happened? Well, someone told Mao that sparrows ate a lot of grain. So he launched a campaign called the Four Pests Campaign, and everyone in China was instructed to kill sparrows. Hundreds of millions of sparrows were killed in 1958, and they mainly died from exhaustion because they were being chased continuously by peasants banging metal pans until they could no longer fly. And then Mao introduced his next great initiative. Everyone must make steel, he said, and that meant everyone. In tiny rural villages, families huddled around little handmade kilns, desperately trying to smelt iron and turn it into steel. They even melted down their own pans and woks. No one worked the fields, so there was no harvest the next year. But as the writers of the Ecclesiastes would have predicted, the Communist Party officials lied, and they sent in reports that boasted of magnificent crop yields. And what little produce did grow was ruined by insects, which had multiplied. Why? Because the sparrows were no longer around to eat them. 20 million Chinese died in the famine. Another 20 million died in the forced labour camps. Socialism does sound more noble than capitalism, and perhaps its aims are in fact more noble. But history teaches that it is market economies that have lifted millions of people out of poverty, while communism has imprisoned millions in terrible poverty.
Yeah, I mean, just the sheer number of deaths there, Jim, it's hard to even process those kinds of numbers. It reminds me of some of our discussions in that church history series. Mm-hmm. What is it then about socialism that causes it to fail so catastrophically?
Well, the really interesting thing about that question, Ollie, is that the answer is theological. Marxist theory has a naive view of sin. Marx taught that sin was a structural flaw in society. Okay? That idea is actually still with us today. I mean, if you look at the ideologies of the progressive left, they are all neo-Marxist because they all insist that evil is a structural flaw in society. So feminists locate evil in the patriarchy. Critical theorists locate evil in what they call whiteness. The LGBT community locates evil in heteronormativity. Like all good Marxists, these people say that salvation comes by fixing a structural flaw in society. For Mao and Lenin, of course, the structural flaw was the division between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, between those who make stuff and those who own stuff. Now, contrast that with Christianity's view of evil. The Bible has a much more profound view of evil. In the words of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. Christianity says that the heart of the human problem is the problem of the human heart. So socialism fails above all else because it has a naive view of human nature.
In this conversation, we've adopted a fairly positive view of global financial systems. But you said at the start that it contains a fatal flaw. These systems contain a fatal flaw. What are the big problems with markets then?
Well, there are three surface problems, and actually there are four, but we're only going to talk about three in this episode. There are three surface problems and one really deep problem. And the surface problems are the moral limits of markets, then secondly, the difference between creativity and speculation, and finally, the rise of monopolies.
Let's think about these three problems in turn then. The philosopher Michael Sandel has published a book called What Money Can't Buy, and in that book, he explores what we might call the moral limits of markets. And there are certain things that just feel wrong to reduce to commodities that can be traded. And Sandel gives examples such as the outsourcing of war to private mercenaries, private prisons, outsourcing of pregnancy to surrogate mothers, and the election campaign financing system.
Yes, he also criticizes things like carbon offsets, which allow corporations to buy and sell the right to pollute. So that's the first problem, the moral limits of markets. Okay. The second problem is a thing called speculation. So the point I've been banging on about in this episode is that a market is really just a device to manage complexity. But of course, that device can be misused. If you think back to our discussion about Britain in the 19th century, I made the point that Britain's financial system introduced us this flood of innovation and creativity. But too often in our world today, financial markets are used by speculators who create nothing. They're just gamblers. And I think cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin are a good example of gambling. There is nothing of any intrinsic value involved. In technical language, there are no dividends. The whole thing is based on the hope that gullible people will keep driving the price up, allowing the speculator to cash out before the bubble bursts.
The third surface problem with markets is the rise of monopolies. And we have to give Marx credit for identifying this crucial problem with capitalism, that it does tend to create monopolies.
Yeah, I think this is the main problem with capitalism at this point in history. The enormous power held by corporates. I mean, just think of the power of Amazon and Google and Apple. Many of them have more power than national governments. The drive to reduce costs through economy of scale is always going to move markets to produce these incredibly powerful beasts. And it's really interesting that way back in the ancient book of Leviticus, I think there is a solution to the problem which Marx identified, and it's a thing called the Jubilee year. Every 50 years, all debts had to be cancelled. So obviously, if I knew that the Jubilee year was a long way off, I could borrow like crazy to invest. But if I knew that it was only a couple of years away, I'd find it really hard to borrow because my investors would lose all their money. So the Jubilee year acted a bit like a braking system or a pressure valve in a hydraulic system. It kept the financial system from blowing up. But contrast that with our system today. One day last year, Jeff Bezos made over $8 billion in one day. So the system is clearly out of control. Now, so anyway, those were the three surface problems we talked about. There is actually a fourth, that markets tend to create societies of individual consumers rather than a community committed to the common good. But we're going to talk about that in our episode called Cities, okay?
The Bible is very clear that there is something cancerous at the heart of the global financial system because it ends up being destroyed in Revelation 18.
That's right. This is the deep problem. The first really sinister step occurs actually back in chapter 13 of Revelation, where we see the global system of commerce being used as an instrument of social control. John introduces this terrifying idea. It used to terrify me as a child, the mark of the beast. And he says, no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark. That is the name of the beast or the number of his name. And the number, of course, was 666. So one of the real dangers of a global system of commerce is that those who do not conform in society can be excluded from using a platform that controls the buying and selling of everything, even food and clothes.
But in the end, by chapter 18, the whole system comes crashing down, and John imagines its collapse like the fall of the city of Babylon. He says, "The kings of the earth will weep and wail over her when they see the smoke of her burning, and the merchants of the earth weep and mourn for her, since no one buys their cargo any more, cargo of gold, silver, jewels, pearls, fine linen, purple cloth, silk, scarlet cord, all kinds of scented wood, all kinds of articles of ivory, all kinds of articles of costly wood, bronze, iron and marble, cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine, oil, fine flour, wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and chariots, and slaves, that is, human souls."
John is using terrible irony in that passage, isn't it? Because he deliberately leaves slaves, that is, real human souls, to the very last entry in a big list of what he calls cargo. It's brilliant from a literary point of view. And he goes on to identify a third group of mourners. He says that all the shipmasters and the seafaring men, sailors and all whose trade is on the sea, stood far off and cried out as they saw the smoke of her burning. What city was like the great city? And they threw dust on their heads, and they wept and mourned. So everyone involved in global trade, governments, investors, supply chain people, everyone just stands in horror as the whole thing blows up in less than a day.
To understand why the system will collapse, we need to understand why John keeps calling it Babylon. And that brings us eventually to our focus for this series, which is on origins. To understand the significance of Babylon in Scripture, we need to go back to the moment it was founded. And we find that story recorded in Genesis chapter 11. It is the story of the Tower of Babel.
Yes, if you want to understand something, look for its origination point. It's the story of the Tower of Babel, which identifies the fatal flaw in our global financial system.
Let me just read a few verses from that story. As people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of man had built.
Now, the interesting thing is that in the previous chapter, chapter 10, Scripture tells us that Babel was the first of a series of cities built by this sinister figure called Nimrod. The name Nimrod means he will rebel. And Babel is described in chapter 10 as the beginning of Nimrod's kingdom. Now, the author's use of that phrase, the beginning, is really deliberate. Because remember, we first encountered the idea of the beginning in Genesis 1 verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But here, the city builders have invented their own beginning. They've created a new origin story.
The difference between the two origin stories couldn't be greater. In Genesis 1, it is the Creator who declares that creation is good. So the goodness and value of something is defined in terms of the Creator. But in Genesis 11, it is mankind which defines what is good and valuable.
Exactly. Now, scholars would say that the Tower of Babel wasn't a ziggurat. It was actually more like an ancient skyscraper with an internal dome at the top that was made to look like the heavens. That's what the original Hebrew means. So it probably had the signs of the zodiac or something like that painted on the inside ceiling. So man was projecting meaning onto the heavens. Now, that is the story of humanism. Man becomes the measure of things. Man describes what is meaningful. Man decides how valuable things are. And I think that is the fatal flaw that will bring down the global financial system. I mean, just think back to that long list of cargo that you read out, Ollie, from Revelation 18. The gold, the fine linen, the wood, the marble, the cinnamon, the wheat, and the chariots. In the 17th century, we might have added tulips onto that list. Today, we might add in, I don't know, Ray-Ban sunglasses or something. The point is, we ascribe value to the most arbitrary of things. There's no link back to the source of real value, which of course comes from the Creator. If I was to put that idea in a strapline, I would say that societies driven by a market know the price of everything and the value of nothing.
It's like that moment in the Gospels when Mary of Bethany breaks the alabaster box of precious oil to anoint Jesus. And we hear the sneering voice of Judas, "Why this waste? That could have been sold for a year's wages."
Judas knew the price of everything and the value of nothing.
So your point is that eventually, when the sheer arbitrariness of humanist values gets exposed, once everyone sees that materialistic values have no basis in reality, then the whole system of commerce will collapse.
Yeah, this is the horrible thought, that the global financial system is a castle built in the air. There is no basis for real value. There are only prices driven by the winds of fashion. I came across a great quote from the late Jonathan Sacks, who was the chief rabbi in the UK until his death in 2020. Now, he wasn't a Christian believer, of course, but I think he spoke with great wisdom. So I think this quote is a good way to close off this conversation, Ollie. This is what he said. "When everything that matters can be bought and sold, when shopping becomes salvation, and advertising slogans become our litany, when our worth is measured by how much we earn and spend, then the market is destroying the very virtues on which in the long run it depends. At times such as now, when markets seem to hold out the promise of uninterrupted growth in our satisfaction of desires, the voice of our great religious traditions needs to be heard, warning us of the gods that devour their own children. The idea that human happiness can be exhaustively accounted for in terms of things that we can buy, exchange, and replace is one of the great corrosive acids which eats away the girders on which societies rest. And by the time we've discovered this, it's already too late."
Just before we wrap this episode up, Jim, I have a practical question. In light of our conversation about commerce, how should young Christians view money?
That's a great question. I think 1 Timothy 6, verses 17 to 19 are crucial here. So let me just quote them. Paul says, "As for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is truly life." And whenever I read those verses, I always think of, those little exchange bureaus that you find in airports, the little shop fronts that you walk up to. You walk up to them with a pile of sterling notes and you leave with a pile of euros or something. So you start off rich in one currency and then you end up rich in a different currency. And I think that is Paul's thought here at the end of 1 Timothy. We should live our lives a bit like a currency converter. We use all our earthly wealth by converting it into treasure in heaven. Our Lord makes, of course, exactly the same point in the Sermon on the Mount. So, anyway, that's my advice. Use your money to build up treasure in heaven. Time is running out for all of us. Our days are numbered. The world could end. So we have a bit of time left to make friends in heaven. That's just an example. We can use our material wealth to achieve that goal. So imagine someday, 1,000 years from now, Ollie, a young Indian woman comes up to you in heaven. You've never met her before. And she tells you how she came to faith in Christ. A Bible teacher from Bangalore had visited her village. He had preached the gospel and she had become gloriously saved. The Bible teacher had answered all of her questions, tough questions, because she was an intelligent and thoughtful Hindu. "I want to thank you for what you did," she says. "Me?" you say. "I didn't do anything." "Oh, yes, you did. In 2022, you sent a gift to a little theology college in Bangalore, and that gift allowed the college to squeeze one more candidate onto the course. That candidate was the Bible teacher who came to my village. Now, maybe you never thought about the check after it went into the post, but it got converted. It got converted into a friend in heaven." Now, of course, the principle about treasure in heaven runs deeper than just having connections with other people, although that's important. Think about how giving to the Lord's work affects your own character. So another hypothetical scenario. Let's imagine it's the year 2030, okay? You've now got to that age when you enjoy Channel 4's Grand Designs. Have you seen that?
I've watched the occasional episode if times are desperate.
Well, as you know then, always follows the same plot. A young couple embark on a ridiculous building project. 10 minutes into the programme, they sack their architect and take on the management of the project themselves. 15 minutes later, divorce proceedings loom on the horizon. Bankruptcy is narrowly avoided. And then Kevin MacLeod finishes with an ironic little monologue. So let's imagine that you and Rachel decide to buy an old house and do it up. Nothing wrong with that. It's a creative, healthy thing to do. But somewhere along the line, you get greedy. You want an even bigger living space, an even more impressive kitchen. You start looking at the homes of billionaires and wish you could have all that. And the fun of creative, innovative thinking gets replaced by envy and discontent. But then you catch yourself on. You know what? You say. Let's not further extend the mortgage. Let's drop the amount of overtime we're doing. Instead of me coming home wrecked and irritable, let's take Tuesday nights off whenever we can, have a date night or whatever, and at least once a month we'll go to the prayer meeting. And in that moment, a marriage could be saved. A couple would have shown real spiritual leadership, reminding each other of why they married each other in the first place. Skewed priorities that might have produced disaster in the long run would have been fixed. Commitment to church would have been held up, all because of the way they handled money. They translated one currency into another currency.
Thank you, Jim. This has been a really informative episode. Thank you for listening, everyone, and we really hope you've enjoyed it and found it helpful. Please do continue to reach out to us via Instagram or Twitter, or via our email address, theequipproject@gmail.com. We always love your feedback, and if you have any questions, we'd also love to hear those and try and respond to them. So thank you for listening, and we'll see you all again next week.